is Leon and the Champion Chip, Chapter 20, entitled Parents' Night. Mr. Sparks sat on the edge of his desk. He smiled at the parents as they filed into the lab. Only a few of them smiled back. Some even squinted and scowled, treating the science teacher like some toxic slide sample stuck under the lens of a microscope. Lily Matisse's mom stopped by to give him some professional advice. "Stand tough," whispered Regina Chaspro. "If you don't, these parents will devour you like snack food." The feeding frenzy the art teacher predicted started before Mr. Sparks even had a chance to make an introduction. "Potato chips?" a matronly figure queried harshly. She had a very large bosom, festooned with a fat rope of pearls and a diamond brooch shaped in a bee. Mr. Sparks felt as if he'd been caught eating peas with a knife. "Mrs. Breed, is it?" "It most certainly is," the woman affirmed. "Tell us, Mr. Sparks, how on earth can potato chips educate my Antoinette?" "Yeah, teach," a burly man with a crew cut chimed in. "Henry Lumpkin Sr. here. Answer the lady. What's the deal with the junk food?" Mrs. Breed glowered. She had no patience for interruptions, even when they confirmed her own views. "As I was attempting to say, Mr. Sparks, how can you justify an entire year devoted to a substance of such questionable nutritional value?" "Potato chips are not nutritionally questionable, as long as they feed the curiosity of your children," said Mr. Sparks. Mrs. Breed winced. "Oh, please." "Yeah, give me a break," echoed Lumpkin Sr. Mr. Sparks shot a desperate look at Regina Chaspro. "Potato chips can be wholesome if you choose the right brand," the art teacher improvised. "Wrong," a parent blurted out. "What makes you such an expert?" said Emma Zeisel. "Dr. Joseph Parmigiano, DDS. And in case anyone's wondering, those 3 letters at the end of my name indicate I'm a dentist. That's what makes me an expert. You can take my word for it. Potato chips are dental time bombs. They're worse than candy, which is why I refuse to let my Flossie eat them." "Bottom line, Teach," barked Lumpkin Sr., "we don't need some ponytailed loon in green sneakers forcing our kids to eat chips. Hank Jr. eats plenty all on his own." Mr. Sparks struggled to keep his cool. "Okay, Mr. Lumpkin, I get it. You don't approve of my clothing or my educational methods. It's true. I don't wear a crisp white lab coat or sensible lace-ups, and I don't make your children memorize the life cycle of the frog or the parts of the flowering plant. But if the school had wanted that kind of science teacher, they wouldn't have hired me." A lethal silence spread through the lab. Parents shifted in their seats as the battle lines were drawn between the pro and anti-potato chip factions. This was not how Mr. Sparks had hoped to start things off. He had planned to demonstrate the principles of combustion using a rocket fuel he had brewed out of potato chips, sugar, yeast, and warm water. But he abandoned the Parents' Night experiment when he realized that Mrs. Breed, Lumpkin Sr., and Dr. Joseph Parmigiano, DDS, were doing a fine job triggering an explosion all by themselves. A late arrival only made matters worse. "Don't mind me," said Principal Birdwhistle, as she tiptoed across the lab and took a seat near the inflated python. "We were just discussing the value of the potato chip curriculum," said Mr. Sparks. "Value indeed," huffed Mrs. Breed. Mr. Sparks looked to Principal Birdwhistle for some guidance, but she responded with a wishy-washy shrug that said, "You're on your own." Fortunately, he wasn't. "I don't know why everyone's getting twisted into pretzels about a silly snack food," said Emma Zeisel. Think about last year. Remember Miss Hagmeyer? The woman forced our kids to sew cloth animals stuffed with her old pantyhose. I don't recall anyone complaining about her kooky teaching methods. Frankly, I'll take potato chips over pantyhose any day of the week. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Sorry, Toots, said Lumpkin Sr. Potato chips are a lot worse than underwear for one obvious reason. He patted his sizable paunch. I must concur, said Mrs. Breed. But let's not forget about cavities, bacteria, and plaque, Dr. Parmigiano noted. And while we're on the topic of undergarments, said Mrs. Breed, there is something I've been meaning to ask you, Mr. Sparks. Fire away. My Antoinette tells me you remove your clothing during class. Is that true? It is, said Mr. Sparks, but strictly for educational purposes, he quickly added. Here, let me show you. He undid his button-down and revealed a T-shirt that said, We know nothing at all. All our knowledge is but the knowledge of schoolchildren. Albert Einstein. Tough to argue with a Nobel Prize winner, said Emma Zeisel. Especially a Nobel Prize winner who, your kids may have told you, was born on March 14th. What's so special about March 14th, said Lumpkin Sr. It just happens to be National Potato Chip Day, said Emma Zeisel. Your point, Mr. Sparks? Mrs. Breed demanded imperiously. My point is simple. The fifth graders aren't just learning about potato chips. They're learning from potato chips. And I might add, I am learning from them. Principal Birdwhistle looked up from her clipboard. Do you mean, Franklin, that you learn from the potato chips or from the students? From both, said Mr. Sparks. I learn from both. The response appeared to satisfy his boss. An Asian woman with long black hair raised her hand. Miss Dabanandana, said Mr. Sparks. Your potato chip experiments are very good. I've never seen my PW so excited about science. He even is helping in a restaurant to earn extra money for a research project. Leon's doing the same thing, said Emma Zeisel. And Lily Matisse has been extraordinarily helpful around the art studio, Regina Jaspro interjected. Nevertheless, said Mrs. Breed, it is absurd to treat potato chips like precious diamonds. I agree, said Mr. Sparks. Potato chips are much more valuable. Well, huffed Mrs. Breed, clutching her gem-encrusted B-shaped brooch. Look around you at the room, said Mr. Sparks. Can diamonds teach your kids about the conservation of energy, about timekeeping, about aerodynamics, about dichotomous classification, about the growth of Puranospora infestans? What the heck is that, Teach? Potato rot, Mr. Sparks, pointing to the tuber standing on the filing cabinet. Professor Spud is part of a long-term unit on optics and data collection. We've been documenting his decay using pinhole cameras made from recycled potato chip cans. Here, take a look. I think they're pretty nifty. While the parents inspected the chip can cameras, Mr. Sparks went around the lab with an open bag of chips. He quickly realized that the bag of chips was much more than a snack. It was a barometer of support. The parents who accepted his offer did so to endorse the all chips, all the time curriculum. The parents who declined were rejecting his methods. It came as no surprise that Mrs. Breed, Lumpkin Sr., and Dr. Parmigiano, DDS, said no. But the reaction Mr. Sparks knew mattered most was that of Principal Birdwhistle. She reached inside the bag. That was a good sign, one that prompted Mr. Sparks to breathe a sigh of relief. But just when he thought he was off the hook, he noticed that the principal removed her hand without a chip. Mr. Sparks put on a brave face. Oh, darn, he said. Look at the hour. He pointed at a wall of wired potatoes, thankful it was time to wrap things up. I guess we got sidetracked by the lively discussion. As the parents began to leave the lab, Mr. Sparks said, "Oh, and a quick reminder. My co-researchers and I will be taking a field trip next week, so please make sure to hand in their trip waivers." "The form says the class is traveling to a research center," Mrs. Brede said suspiciously. "That's right," said Mr. Sparks. "We'll be studying Globuli solaniani." Mrs. Brede frowned. "Nothing dangerous, I trust?" "Entirely harmless," said Mr. Sparks. "I don't know, Teach," said Lumpkin Sr. "This globuli stuff, it sounds like a mouthful." "It is," said Mr. Sparks, "but nothing your kids can't handle."